From the historic campus of Hillsdale College in Hillsdale, Michigan, where the good, the true, and the beautiful are taught, nurtured, and honored, this is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, bringing the activity and education of the college to listeners across the country.
We need objective information to process because we're thinking adults and it's a free society, and obviously future health crises will occur, and many things will be told to us by our elected government, by people in the media. We need to be able to filter out truth from non-truth.
This is your host, Scot Bertram. Welcome to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. That was Dr. Scott Atlas, Robert Wesson Senior Fellow in Healthcare Policy at the Hoover Institution, a Fellow at Hillsdale's Academy for Science and Freedom, and co-director at the Global Liberty Initiative. We'll talk in depth about his recommendations for ways to restore trust in public health officials. Dr. Atlas, thanks for joining us.
Happy to be here.
You wrote a piece at Real Clear Politics, Today's Public Health Emergency, Restoring Trust with 7 Steps. In it, you say faith in health agencies has plummeted more rapidly since 2019 than any other government institution. What's the consequences of that? Why should we be so concerned?
Well, because of the really mismanagement, the lack of information transparency, and mandated behaviors against common sense and against all basic scientific evidence, the public has lost faith not only in our government institutions like the FDA and the CDC, as I mentioned in the piece, with almost 2/3 now rating their performance as only fair or poor, but half of America expresses little confidence in science itself. This is important because as an objective society, we need to trust the so-called objective people. Mm-hmm. And that has generally been the credible, expert class. In this sort of area, science and medical science, public health guidance, people don't have time, regular people, to go through the data. It's not that it's that complicated, but we do rely and respect the so-called authoritative figures because we're busy working, we're busy trying to make decisions for our families, and we need objective information to process because we're thinking adults and it's a free society, and obviously future health crises will occur, and many things will be told to us by our elected government, by people in the media. We need to be able to filter out truth from non-truth.
Thankfully, you are here with 7 recommendations on initial executive orders for someone, a president, who might want to restore trust in public health. And we'll see how many we can talk about in our time together today. The very first one is to clearly define by law a public health emergency with strict time limits that would require legislation to extend. You have an example here of perhaps 2 weeks. What do you think is an appropriate length? Why is it perhaps 2 weeks for emergency powers to be able to be used?
Well, what we saw during the pandemic is the declaration of a health emergency that therefore allowed everything, including our basic constitutional freedoms, to be overridden. We frankly had human rights violations where our guarantees were reversed and without any limit. I think most people, when we heard this phrase, 2 weeks to slow the spread, I think people were on board with temporary things. But ultimately, that was never ended. And that allows, as we saw, unlimited overriding of individual rights beyond even our system of laws. And frankly, this is very destructive, not only because of the lack of time limit, because of the lack of a definition of what a public health emergency is. Mm-hmm. This term could be used and implemented in many things, including, for instance, climate change, just as one example.
Right.
But we could invoke that as leaders. Leaders could invoke that declaration of a health emergency to facilitate any kind of maneuver. So we need to, A, define public health emergency. We need to have a clear definition. B, we need to limit its extent so that there is accountability, there is a need for thoughtful elected leaders to have a chance to weigh in, because that's how the public speaks in a democracy, through our elected officials.
You recommend adding term limits to all health agency positions after first cleaning house of all heads of CDC, NIH, FDA. We talk often about term limits for legislators, whether it be in individual states or in Congress, too. Is the rationale behind it the same for why term limits might be useful for health agency positions?
I think the rationale is similar, but I think this is an unspoken area. I think regular people, including myself, are not aware of the power of bureaucrats who are entrenched. I saw when I went into the White House and into Washington that the people working in the agencies were there for their entire careers. They outlasted elected administrations. In fact, in many ways, they have more power than the elected officials. The people, just was one flagrant example. Anthony Fauci was a bureaucrat for 38 years. We had people, Birx was a bureaucrat for decades. We have people in the CDC, the NIH, the FDA, and most agencies that spend their careers there. They accrue power, they cover for each other, and they set up unhealthy relationships with outside parties, including the media, and they know. The truth is, they know they outlast a president or a presidential administration or an appointed head of their agency. So we need to limit that. We need to get rid of the people who are entrenched. We need to have a far more accountability in these people. It's an unhealthy situation when people are there because they develop these perverse incentives like their own careers instead of the common good for the people. It's much better to have people come in, have a life and a career outside the government.
Right.
And this is a temporary stop to help their country.
Talking with Dr. Scott Atlas, his piece at Real Clear Politics, today's public health emergency, Restoring Trust with 7 Steps. You say that we should forbid all drug royalty sharing by employees of FDA, NIH, CDC. Perhaps this is a first time that people are understanding this actually occurs. It seems to be a clear conflict of interest. How did it happen in the first place, and why is it still allowed?
This is a shock, I think, to everyone who, when I speak about this in public, and it was frankly a shock to me, the extent of this, but I had no idea, I don't think most people do, that the drugs FDA, NIH, CDC work on and ultimately approve, employees of these agencies share drug royalties. I mean, this is such a shocking, overt conflict of interest. This must be forbidden. And Open the Books revealed that in the decade from, say, 2009 to 2020 or 21, royalty payments totaling over $300 million were paid to employees of the NIH. I mean, this is outrageous. We also know that Francis Collins, the NIH's former director, received dozens of payments, as did Anthony Fauci over that decade, this 2010 to 2021. This is a shocking conflict of interest. Hundreds of agency employees get personal profit. This must be forbidden. And also, I think there's a second part of this, which is forbidding this sort of open door exchange between private jobs after government service, because this sets up a conflict of interest, which of course doesn't mean that everyone is evil doing these things. It's simply that there is, by definition, a lack of objective judgment that is opened up when you have a job waiting for you on the other end. We need to stop that. We need to really do everything we can to limit that. We need good people who work in private sector to work in the government, but we can't have direct payments being made to people to approve things in positions of power.
You say we should require full transparency of FDA, CDC, NIH discussions with immediate posting to public forums. I have heard objections or concerns, I guess I would say, about in situations like this, people are afraid to be free and open. People are afraid to speak their minds because they know that what they say will be made public. Are you concerned about that at all in these discussions inside those organizations?
No, I'm not. I think that's an excuse. The people are supposed to be the boss of the people who work in the FDA, the CDC, the NIH. We need accountability. The biggest problem with corruption is the secrecy, the lack of accountability, the lack of transparency. If they can't say something in public, then they shouldn't be saying it. I don't understand this rationale at all. I have no sympathy for it. When you work for the country, when you give your opinion, you ought to be able to say it in public. The people are in charge, not the advisors. And we need transparency there. I see no other way to ensure accountability other than to make it visible to the public.
Dr. Scott Atlas with us, his 7 steps to restoring trust, public trust in health and health organizations. You say a restatement with an executive order that the CDC and other health organizations are strictly advisory and don't have the power to set laws or mandates. Which is true, in which we knew, but during COVID especially, it seemed like many executives in positions were more than willing to pass the buck and simply say, this is what the CDC says, this is what we're going to do. What would restating this, what effect would that have?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's true that this isn't creating a new rule. It's simply stating something publicly that should be emphasized both to the public and to the officials, the people in power, because from the president on down, the governors, the public health officials, most university presidents, etc., most of these people said, oh, the CDC says this, therefore we are doing that, as if they're not responsible, the individuals making that statement. The people that are in positions of power, if they can't handle the positions of power and the responsibility of that position, they should resign, frankly. And so we need that pretense that somehow the CDC is in charge to be eliminated, because these people hide behind the CDC and other agencies instead of taking responsibility. And I think restating this very clearly to the public sort of eliminates the illusion that the CDC is the rule setter. I think people, regular people, many of them, I would guess, believe that the CDC literally set the rules and the people in charge were simply following the rules. They had no choice. And that's simply false.
Decentralize today's cartel of NIH funding that controls all academic science careers in university medical centers. Now, people who are not in medicine or in the health profession might not understand how this works. Walk us through a bit where that funding comes from and how it affects or influences perhaps those who want to have a career in science or research.
This is very important for the public to understand. Scientific research, all scientific research, is essentially controlled by a small group of people. Why do I say that? Well, first of all, most university medical centers, they can't exist without NIH. They depend on NIH money. More than 15 U.S. university medical centers receive over $500 million each every single year in funding from the NIH. They therefore have, again, the conflict of interest. They're going to be very reluctant to speak up against the NIH. Secondly, all academic scientists, and therefore all science research, really in the United States, is controlled by NIH funding. Every career of every assistant professor, to get promotion, you must get an NIH grant and to continue to be promoted, to maintain your position. So what happens is that because you're dependent on the NIH grant, you're not willing to speak up against the NIH, but even more importantly, you're there doing research that you know has a greater likelihood of getting funding. The NIH funding is not just the dollar amount. They also put out a list of what they're going to fund, what type of projects. So they're heavily influencing what kind of research is done. It does not allow for independent science. And this is really a small group of people, what I call a cartel, because the small group of people at the top signing off on the funding are the same people who control the scientific publications because they're the editors of the scientific journals. They're the same people who are the heads of the departments in the universities. It's a very a very small network of people that control all the careers, all of the research. And this is very destructive. We need to decentralize the funding. We need to split up the authority. We can't have a tiny group of individuals control all research. We saw what was happening during COVID, where they didn't just not fund research. that could have led to earlier drug therapy with already approved drugs. They also blocked publications. They preferentially published things that supported their narrative. That's not how science is done. That's, in fact, antithetical to science.
Dr. Scott Atlas with us. Today's Public Health Emergency, Restoring Trust with 7 Steps. You can find this at Real Clear Policy. The 7th step, immediately halt all binding agreements or pledges to the World Health Organization. Now, a lot of this has to do with instilling confidence in Americans in what's happening in our country with health organizations. But the World Health Organization is one that had its reputation left in tatters in the wake of COVID. Does the WHO have any hope of being an organization that can serve the public health anywhere moving forward?
Well, I think it's very important that we have the WHO in a very high quality functional state. It's helpful to the world. First of all, there are global health issues. We, as a rich nation, have an interest in helping other countries. We also have the WHO functioning as a data repository, as issuing guidelines, as helping in health disasters, and particularly in poor countries. So it has a potential for doing very, very positive things for not just the U.S., but the world. And I think we're all for that in the theoretical sense. The problem is that the WHO's record is abysmal. In the last several pandemics, it was either late or completely wrong about everything it did. It exhibited gross incompetence under the director, Tedros. And Tedros himself really did some very bad things, including backing China's reckless human rights violations with their severe lockdowns, praising them as saying they should be congratulated for their extraordinary measures as people were killing themselves and literally imprisoned in China during COVID. The WHO disregarded the evidence and published strange and changing narratives on mitigation measures. They censored their own employees for talking about the biological fact of the limited amount of spread from asymptomatic people. They changed definitions of scientific terms. And, they basically, Tedros himself said China was, quote, setting a new standard for outbreak response, unquote, and praised them for transparency while China was blocking the committee organized by the WHO to look at the origins of COVID. So there's a corrupt nature to the problems at the WHO, and we have leverage because the U.S. is the largest funding country to the WHO activities. What's frightening to people that they should be aware of is that the Biden administration's ambassador to the WHO, her name is Hamamoto, she's already stated, quote, the U.S. is committed to the WHO's pandemic accord. The WHO's pandemic accord is not even finally written, first of all, so that's a very strange statement to make for someone who's supposed to be representative of the United States government. Secondly, that pandemic accord is going to be legally binding, and it does things like defines public health emergency for other countries. It has the authority in the draft form to declare that there's a public health emergency in your country. I frankly am stunned that any sovereign nation would allow a third party to legally define and impose restrictions on a country for a public health emergency. But this is not acceptable. This should not be acceptable to any United States president. It should not be acceptable to any free country. We need to rein in what's going on and take a very good look at the activities and at the potential corruption, since the WHO's record, and particularly the director Tedros's record, has been frankly abysmal. There's no better word to say it, including stonewalling information and supporting China's stonewalling of this recent pandemic.
Final question for Dr. Scott Atlas. Those on the left perhaps would look at the situation and blame the public and say, why won't you trust us? Trust the science. Do what we advise in times of serious health emergencies. We've laid out this plan today, these 7 steps that would say perhaps the health officials have given the public no reason to trust them. Is there a way to bring this together in some sort of bipartisan fashion?
Well, I have a little bit of idealism left in me. And I would say that, yes, I think people on both sides or every side of the spectrum of political belief or other belief would want more transparency. I'm not sure why you would be opposed to transparency, which is sort of the gist of a lot of these recommendations I've made. I think a lot of people have enough skepticism to want term limits on people, to eliminate drug royalty sharing. So I think some of these things are obvious and acceptable to everybody. I don't believe that any of this is political, frankly. It's really just all about getting information to citizens and having some restoration of accountability to people that has to exist in a free society. I don't view any of this as political, but the question is, are people just simply not interested in creating any kind of agreement? Because I think that would be the only way that this wouldn't be agreeable to everybody.
Dr. Scott Atlas, you can read his piece at Real Clear Politics, today's Public Health Emergency, Restoring Trust with 7 Steps. He is a fellow at Hillsdale's Academy for Science and Freedom, the Robert Wesson Senior Fellow in Healthcare Policy at the Hoover Institution at Stanford, and co-director of the Global Liberty Institute. Dr. Atlas, thanks so much for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Up next, we conclude our series with Dr. Christopher Busch from Hillsdale's English Department, taking a look at some of the most prominent works of Robert Frost. I'm Scot Bertram. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Hi, I'm Benjamin Payne. At the K-12 Education Office at Hillsdale College, we support school founding groups and their efforts to start classical schools across the country. Finding the right leader is one of the first and most important steps to building a successful school. While we do consider experience in education, we seek candidates who exhibit unwavering personal integrity, honesty, courage, and servant-hearted leadership. Perhaps that's you. If you're looking to engage in fulfilling, impactful, and challenging work protecting our nation's future and building up the next generation of virtuous citizens, we'd love to hear from you. I'm looking for strong school leaders right now. Learn more about how you can make a difference at hillsdale.edu/leader. hillsdale.edu/LEADER. That's hillsdale.edu/leader.
Welcome back to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. I'm Scot Bertram. Be sure to find us on the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. You can find this show and many others at podcast.hillsdale.edu. We're joined by Dr. Christopher Busch, professor of English at Hillsdale College. Dr. Busch, thanks so much for joining us.
Great to be here, Scott.
Continuing and finishing our brief series on the life, themes, and the work of Robert Frost. This conversation will talk about some of his specific works and dig a bit deeper in there. I want to open it up. Where should we start with Robert Frost? Where do you start with your students?
Well, Scott, I often start with The Road Not Taken from his third book, Mountain Interval, that we've talked about earlier. Mm-hmm. And then I always spend a lot of time on Birches as well. Probably to begin with his first book, A Boy's Will, which is filled with lyric poetry. He has a beautiful poem called Mowing. And what's interesting is that he learned how to mow hay using a scythe. And so, in fact, he undoubtedly used some of that experience in writing the poem Mowing. Mm-hmm. The poet Seamus Heaney in a program, a video program, kind of goes through this poem Mowing and really talks about it as a good example of the sound of sense of what Frost is trying to do with his language. And he says, it's not just kind of a simple, like mechanical imitation of mowing, but really the sound of the poem in fact somehow reflects the activity. And I think also in this poem what's interesting is that it's about labor. It's about a simple act of labor connected with a seasonal connection to the land. And so the poem, what he's done is he's created art, really. He's created beauty out of the common life, out of common work. And that really is a kind of a theme that we'll see through much of his poetry. If we go on to his second book, To North of Boston, for example, he has the poem Mending Wall, which again is a poem that refers to the seasons, the seasonal meeting of the neighbors to put the wall back together. The stone wall has kind of fallen down or been taken apart, and his neighbor says, well, good fences make good neighbors, so we better build this wall, put this wall back together. And again, he uses that activity as a kind of a springboard to asking the question, well, why do they make good neighbors? What is the purpose of a wall? He says, before I built a wall, I'd want to ask, what I was walling in or walling out, and to whom I was like to give offense, which is a great play on words there at the end as well. But what's so interesting about that poem, about Mending Wall, in addition to the fact that it has, it's a springtime poem, it's a poem about neighbors meeting, very much rooted in common life, in common land. But what's really interesting about it is that we see in about line 11 or 12, something like that he says, I let my neighbor know beyond the hill. And what's remarkable about it is if our speaker is so opposed to wall building as he seems to be, why does he initiate that? And it's just a very interesting question. And so I think that, again, is a very powerful poem. Mending Wall is one that listeners might be familiar with. If we go, we talked a little bit about The Road Not Taken from his third book, but if we go down to the fourth book, New Hampshire, which I think was his first Pulitzer Prize from New Hampshire, he has some very, very interesting poems in there. There's one called A Star in a Stone Boat, which is an interesting poem because Frost had sold subscriptions, I think it was to the Youth's Companion, and he used that money to buy a telescope. Well, a stone boat was basically a kind of a sled that was dragged behind horses, and every year the farmers would go over their fields and they would pick up the stones that had come up from the frost and during the winter and put them on the stone boat. Well, one time, apparently, in the poem, they come upon a small fragment, I guess, of a meteor. So it's a star in a stone boat, which is kind of a wonderful thing of, linking that activity of digging in the earth or being in the earth with the stars. So I think he's quite he's meditative in New Hampshire. He has a poem called Nothing Gold Can Stay, and talks about the coming of spring and how the first green of nature, the first sprouting of nature, is something that doesn't last. Of course, at spring here in Michigan, especially, we notice that we wait for it all through the winter, and then it comes and it's gone before we know it. And I think he uses that again, that nature as a springboard. Nothing gold can stay. There's a sense that the best things in life often kind of are there, and then they're fleeting. They kind of evaporate. And so I think that's something that he's interested in that poem. One other poem, Scott, if I could just add one more that I think is interesting from that fourth volume, New Hampshire, is called For Once Then Something. And again, he starts in a very unexceptional place. The speaker, the voice in the poem is kind of looking down into a well, into a hand-dug well, and always looking, always trying to see, what's down in there, and I think some of the people make fun of him. Why are you looking down into that well? And then he ends up thinking that maybe he sees something. Maybe there's something beyond simply, the water and the bottom of the well, and it becomes metaphor for maybe there's something beyond what we can see that maybe we will once, maybe from time to time we might get a glimpse of. And so he says, for once then something. Yes, what was it? We don't know for sure what it was, but it's a hint that maybe it's worthwhile to be looking, and maybe we will be rewarded by actually seeing something. So again, looking into a well, very unexceptional, but at the same time then as a springboard for trying to think about what is beyond this world that we can see, and when does it come out kind of from hiding in a sense.
Dr. Christopher Busch with us, professor of English at Hillsdale College, talking about Robert Frost and some of his most well-known, best poems. We talked about birches in our last conversation, but I did want to ask specifically about the theme in that poem about an adult looking and longing for these experiences of youth, the experience of a child playing in those birches. Does he comment on the appropriateness of that? Should we look backwards in that manner? Does it mean that something is wrong or not right with the way we're currently living? Did he comment on that particular style of nostalgia in a way?
Yes, and it's complicated, Scott, which makes that poem so interesting, because if we take him at his word just straight out, we'll miss the nuance, I think, of what he's really trying to say. So he comes to that point in the poem where he says, so was I once myself a swinger of birches, and so I dream of going back to be. And he gives us this really painful image of life full of considerations, and feels like a twig having lashed across our eye. Very painful image. But we have to look back at the poem. Who is the boy in the poem? The boy is a farm boy, the one who's swinging the birch trees. He's a farm boy who lives too far from town to learn baseball, and so must come up with his own play and amuse himself alone. So I think Frost, yes, he will bring the idea of the innocence of childhood forward, and then he'll say, but is it really always like that? What is it that we're really wishing for? And I think so often we're wishing for the world to be the way that we would like it to be. Mm-hmm. And I think what we realize is that maybe the world that we saw as children is perhaps not the world that is. And I don't think he would say, well, we want to go back and, bury our heads in the sand and pretend that it's different than it really is. But I think he's also saying in that poem, don't forget, don't lose that joy of being young, and that hopefulness of being young. Try to be in that space between those dreams and the reality, and not in a sense kind of succumb to either. Mm-hmm. But be in that in-between space.
Frost's poem, The Gift Outright, described as a history of the United States by Frost himself, recited at the inauguration of John F. Kennedy in 1961. Is it, in fact, a celebration of our country?
Well, the history of that poem is interesting. Frost did not intend to recite that poem at the inauguration. He had written another poem for the purpose. And then, he was an old man. It was a very, very bright, sunny day in Washington, and he just really wasn't able to read the poem that he had prepared. And so he decided to recite from memory The Gift outright. And I think it is, it's a celebration, I think, of America. I think it's a celebration of America as a gift to Americans who were at first maybe a little bit hesitant to accept it. And, he says the land was ours before we were the land's. And he goes kind of back and forth about this idea of accepting that. And so he says something we were withholding made us weak until we found out, it was ourselves we were withholding from our land of living, and forthwith found salvation in surrender. And so I think it was finally that we were able to, quote, surrender to the land and allow the land to fill us. And such as she was, he says at the end, such as she would become. I think that's a very, very powerful affirmation. It's a reading of history, a reading of our national history that it's really quite a tender reading, I think, of our history.
Talking Robert Frost with Christopher Busch, Dr. Busch, a professor of English at Hillsdale College. Frost called Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening, one of his better-known works, his best bid for remembrance. Do you think he was accurate in that assessment? And was he successful in that mission?
Well, I think he was successful. Certainly, I think because it's probably the poem that many can remember from elementary school and maybe recite, from memory even. It's interesting that I guess I wouldn't I guess myself that it's his greatest achievement. It's a beautiful poem. It's a short poem, but I think there are others that I would remember if I had to say, I'm only allowed to remember 3. Probably there would be some others that I might want to put up there.
What about your students? When you teach Frost, are there any particular works that they very much connect to or tend to have the greatest insights into? Which Frost poems really work with your students?
Well, the students I think they really do love Frost. And I think many of the students, especially, students who are taking courses, as kind of preparation or whatever, that we all appreciate that Frost is very accessible, that we can understand him and that his language, and they're always delighted because when we get to talk about it, to see, there's another level, there's another kind of something, he's doing something else and wanting us to hang on as he whips us around with his ideas. But what I try to do often is I will try to, have us read poems that might have some special interest. And there's one poem, it's a longer poem, it's called West Running Brook and comes from a book he published by that title that's the title poem, 1928. It's called West Running Brook. And it's a beautiful, beautiful poem. It's a conversational narrative between two people who are recently married, and they're having a conversation about the brook. And of course, we're in New England, and it's odd that a brook would be running west because brooks all run toward the sea, except for this particular one. So it's interesting for the students because the characters in the poem are young. They're involved with one another, and they're having a conversation. They see things from very different points of view. And there are some, the poet intentionally brings up some stereotypes about, men are very analytical and women are very emotional, and then goes ahead and kind of breaks those down later on. And they come together at the end in, I guess you could say, a place of understanding. And that's not always the case in Frost poems. Sometimes he just leaves us without a conclusion, but the ending is, kind of, this is the day that we both said so. But what's beautiful about that, and if I could just take a second or two just to illuminate that poem, they focus on a ripple in the stream, in the brook. And the ripple is caused by a rock. And just for a second, as that black water flows, there's a little white wave. And the wave is pushed back. And he says it points to the source. And I think what Frost is doing is, as the poem develops, is he's saying it's what is in us. It is what is most deeply in us. Our spirit, our soul, our nature, he says, that is like that little ripple, and it points back. I think he really is kind of saying to God. It points back to God. And so I think the students appreciate that as well. There's a real spiritual dimension, I think, to that poem.
Dr. Christopher Busch, professor of English at Hillsdale College, as we complete our series on the biography, the style and themes and the works of Robert Frost. Dr. Busch, thanks so much for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Thank you very much, Scott.
Up next, we talk with Joseph Cella, a Hillsdale graduate, also a former ambassador in the Trump administration and a longtime political consultant. I'm Scot Bertram. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. Hey, it's Scot Bertram, and I've got a challenge for you today. Become a better educated American citizen. And to help you do just that, we at Hillsdale College have our free online courses available for all who wish to learn. Our challenge? Take just one of our courses. There are so many to choose from. You can discover the beauty of the Bible in the Genesis story, study the writings of C.S. Lewis, or explore the true meaning of America in Constitution 101. We have dozens more to choose from, and all these self-paced free courses feature Hillsdale faculty and scholars, many you've heard on this podcast. So visit hillsdale.edu/course, COURSE, and pick one of the more than 30 free Hillsdale courses. I hope you'll accept my challenge. Pick whichever course you like and become a more educated citizen today. Go to hillsdale.edu/course, COURSE. That's hillsdale.edu/course. Welcome back to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. I'm Scot Bertram. Be sure to follow us on X, formerly Twitter. We're at Hillsdale Radio. We're joined by Joseph Cella. He's a 1991 graduate of Hillsdale College, back on campus to accept an alumni award, Outstanding Professional Achievement in American Diplomacy. He served as ambassador to Fiji, Kiribati, Nauru, Tonga, and Tuvalu from 2019 through 2021. Also founder of the National Catholic Prayer Breakfast, member of the Trump transition team, founder principal at Pontifex Group. We'll see how much of this we can ask about in the next 10, 15 minutes or so. Joseph, thanks so much for joining us.
Honored to be here with you guys.
Tell us first a little about your Hillsdale experience, how you ended up here, what you majored in, what you did while you were here on campus.
I applied to several colleges in Michigan and the Midwest. Was accepted to as many, and had visited them all, and was still on the search. Hadn't really found home. My father was a lawyer, a small-town lawyer in the northern suburbs of Detroit, rural town, and his founding partner of the firm, Harold Weller, was a graduate of Hillsdale College in the class of 1932. He said, you should have him take a look at Hillsdale. And my father, by his own upbringing, was a very Western canon, rigorously formed throughout K through 12 and into college. And that is how we were formed as children, and knew that is what Hillsdale offered. So we visited, and it was soon after setting foot on campus that I knew it was home and where I was called to attend college, and it was a great blessing to be a student here.
I want to come back. We'll ask more questions about Hillsdale in a little bit, but this job, this ambassadorship for these countries, for a couple of years during the Trump administration, I have to ask something very simple. What does an ambassador do? What are the duties of an ambassador, of a diplomat? What are you expected to do in that role?
Well, your principal role, Scott, is to discharge the foreign policy of the administration you're serving in, whether you are a non-career ambassador such as myself or a career foreign service officer serving as an ambassador, where you are given taskings specifically from the president through the Secretary of State. You read them, and it varies from region to region. My AOR, or area of responsibility, was under the umbrella of East Asia and Pacific, and that has its own set of constituencies and geopolitical dynamics that were outlined in that charge that I had to keep. So, and it is really up to the chief of mission, the ambassador, as to how to execute it. You're turned to for your background, your principles, your work ethic, your experience to execute what you've been given, and set about doing so with great vigor with my beautiful wife and our dear 7 children, and a great team we had at the embassy.
Yeah, I don't know if that's the first time you've lived overseas, but what is that like for you personally, and then your family of seven kids, your wife living somewhere that's not here in the United States?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it was our first time overseas, and I have to tell you, our departure day was a bit of a scene out of a Chris Farley movie. We were the last ones on the plane. We were probably an hour and a half too late to the airport, my fault, and it probably is the first time that all people sitting in business class shared it with 7 children under 14 and under, and their parents, and that's a custom when you first go out to post, and when you return, you fly business class all the way. So, but that was a unique experience, and it was the beginning of a beautiful entree of serving our country and representing our principles in many unique ways.
Talking with Joseph Cella, class of 1991 here at Hillsdale, back on campus to receive an alumni award for professional achievement in American diplomacy. You've done other things too, including being one of the founders of the National Catholic Prayer Breakfast around 20 years ago or so. This is separate from the National Prayer Breakfast. So why was something else needed, and why did you create it?
Yeah, I draw much inspiration from our evangelical brothers and sisters in many ways. And one of the things that they launched during the Eisenhower administration was the National Prayer Breakfast, and it's prospered since. And in last couple of years, there's had been some challenges. In 2003, I happened to be reading some writings of the late Pope John Paul about the new evangelization. It was a charge where he articulated how we all have an obligation to preach the gospel in ways that are new in methods, ardor, and expression. And I happened to be watching President Busch at the National Prayer Breakfast, and I thought, okay, boy, what a great way to plant the flag on behalf of the Catholic Church. All are welcome to come, and all have been over the years, and it's been a great blessing. And we've had anywhere from 900 to 3,000 people since 2004. President Busch attended all the last 4 years of administration. We've had some Supreme Court justices and other distinguished leaders, but it's been a great joy and borne great fruit.
You also served as a member of the Trump transition team when he became president. Again, a very simple question that I ask myself when I see these stories is, what exactly does a transition team do? Everyone has one. Governors and mayors and senators and presidents, they have transition teams. What do you do on a transition team?
Yeah, it's a process that begins really with all candidates, whether they even cleared the primary or not, and they prepare for a scenario where they are the nominee and a scenario where they are elected to be president of the United States. So they are given the various positions to fill within the administration, key leaders within them across the intergovernment agency, but more importantly, the key policies that you want to bound out of the gates with, ranging from executive orders to legislative policies. And then my realm as a volunteer on the campaign, it was in these coalitions and outreach, and I was charged managing the Catholic Advisory Group and running interface with the press and advancing talking points and doing media interviews, and then was called upon to serve in the transition team to make sure issues of greatest importance to spiritual, anything that would touch from judicial nominations to other realms of faith, life issues, and care for the poor, marriage, and it was a very aggressive, a very intensive period, running up to Inauguration Day. So after the election happens, there is sort of a two-phase to the presidential transition team. So there are people that are known as a beachhead teams. So they will go into the intergovernmental agencies and start having dialogues with their counterparts. And then on Inauguration Day, they're called landing teams. So they arrive after the inauguration, after swearing in, and they will take their posts and they will begin the act of governing, and the president goes to the Oval Office and begins executing things, executive orders, and setting other things in motion and getting security briefings and so forth. So, but again, an honor to serve in that capacity as well.
Joseph Cella has also been involved as an advisor, consultant on any number of campaigns across the country as part of his role as founder and principal of the Pontifex Group. How do you run a campaign differently today than perhaps 10 years ago, 15 years ago? It feels like politics has changed drastically over that course of time.
That is one of the finest questions I've had in that regard. And my first campaign, Scott, was in 1985. My father ran for my hometown city council, the city of Richmond in Macomb County, Michigan. And we were his campaign team. It involved a simple going door to door for him to every house in our city, with a flyer, and I remember these little sticky letters that my mom used to, it was like, get out the vote campaign flyer, primitive. But he got it and served several terms on city council. So that was my first entree. But it certainly went from very conventional print, phone banking, mailing, and some radio and TV, depending on the level of the campaign. But certainly when the digital revolution hit, I would say in 1995, things really began to accelerate and morph. Social media was born, and it took on, again, the pace increased. I think the costs in some respects were bled out, but in other ways they've increased. Mm-hmm. So I've said, reflecting in the past, how there was always the 24-hour news cycle when CNN was born, and in I'd say the early 90s. But now, and this is affecting our culture, I think. I think if you consider social media, I think we have a 0.24 second news cycle now. And you have citizen journalists. I think it's shining the light on some not so objective reporting and some agenda-driven reporting. So it's been a blessing, but it does cut both ways. But it certainly has impacted I'd say the volatility of campaigns.
You have this amazing opportunity to go from Hillsdale College, being a student and a graduate, and all that the college stands for and teaches and values, to a position in your life where you are literally representing the country as a diplomat for a presidential administration. I doubt you saw that in your future when you were here on campus. Where did you see yourself?
Since I was 6 years old, knew that I was drawn to, in a very simple way early on, to the realm of political things, government, and public policy. I found it on the front page of the Wall Street Journal my dad had. I read the news and views section and improved my reading skills, would always watch the morning news, would read the Detroit News and Free Press after I got home in the afternoon, and then would watch the evening news on all networks as I was able. So that was certainly formative, but you never know when a call in life happens from God, and I've been blessed on a number of instances throughout my life to know with great alacrity when something is meant to be, ranging from marrying my wife and the various doors that have opened in which I've served the various capacities. It is you can call it destiny, you can call it providence, but knew that it was meant to happen. And my latest tour of duty was an example of that. I was, one quick story I'll share with you, was an election night. I was wee hours of the morning in New York City, and was asked, could I go into the West Wing, in a leadership capacity and in one of the divisions. And I said, I wanted him to win. The alternative was just not an option for me for a variety of reasons. And I said, I just want to go back to life on a dirt road and my consulting work and live life with my wife and kids, and wasn't really looking for a job, wanted to just win. And that happened. And they said, well, be ready, because the next words out of this person's mouth was, be ready, you're probably going to be offered an ambassadorship. Again, never crossed my mind. But I thought, okay, I digested it, and I thought, okay, that is probably something I could do. It would be a high honor. Grandpa and Dad served in World War I and Korea after being drafted on the stateside. But really a high honor to serve under our flag, advance it in the principles of our country, and put the best face forward that we have with my wife and kids to our brothers and sisters abroad.
Let me ask you a final question, Joseph Cella, 1991 graduate of Hillsdale College. What do you remember from your time on campus that continues to resonate in your life today? Lessons or experiences that still shape you as a person?
The educational formation I had here was very good. It was in the Western canon. So you are taught to read the greats, learn about the greats. You're taught to think. You're taught to write. You're taught to articulate yourself, and critical thinking skills. And that Western canon is indispensable. I have to say my kids have been homeschooled and follow a very rigorous classical program. In fact, our eldest will be a freshman here in a short few weeks. Very proud to say that. But Dr. Arnn has really taken Hillsdale to heights that are just beautiful, and the impact that they have had are beautiful. And hope to speak more about that at tonight's award ceremony. But it is, Hillsdale has always been a known quantity, highly respected, and Dr. Arnn has I think scaled that significantly, depth and breadth wise, and encountered that. In fact, I was honored that Dr. Arnn, in fact, agreed to cut a short video that we played at the embassy's Independence Day celebration in the fall of 2020, and it happened to fall on Constitution Day. So I was very intentional on choosing that day. So it was our independence celebration on a Constitution Day, and again, Dr. Arnn was masterful in his message delivered to our counterparts and fellow countrymen while we were there.
Joseph Cella, a 1991 graduate of Hillsdale College, back on campus to receive an award. Outstanding Professional Achievement in American Diplomacy. He was ambassador to Fiji, Kiribati, Nauru, Tonga, and Tuvalu from 2019 through 2021. And back here, Joseph, thanks so much for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Honored to be here. Thank you, Scott, for the opportunity.
That will wrap up this edition of the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. Our thanks to Dr. Scott Atlas, also Christopher Busch from Hillsdale's English Department, and Joseph Cella, former ambassador and Hillsdale graduate. The Radio Free Hillsdale Hour is recorded at the studios of WRFH, the student-run radio station at Hillsdale College. Remember, you can hear new episodes every week on this station. You also can find extended versions of some of our interviews or listen anytime to the podcast. Find it at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio. The assistant producer of the program is Sam Lair. Until next week, I'm Scot Bertram, and this has been the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.